Zebulun, Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Welcome to the Abracast. I'm your host, John Towers. We're continuing our series of G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Because of the because of the inflation that we're seeing and all the weird shit happening with our money and the Fed, you know, everyone's saying that they're going to raise rates like 7 to 11 more times within the next 2 years. I just wanted us to be armed with a little bit of information about the Federal Reserve and the shenanigans that they get up to. So as we're going through this book, we're not reading like through the whole book like I would normally do. This book is not in public domain or anything like that. So we're just jumping through it. And I wanted to kind of recap the last episode where we were talking about fiat money and paper money. So I think we're going to summarize that and then continue to jump through the book. So I have my weapon of mass distraction mixed up, the perfect formula, and it's housed within the vessel of the art. I'm just going to lube up and we're going to be ready to go here tonight. G. Edward Griffin, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Fiat money is paper money without precious metal backing, which people are required by law to accept. The first recorded appearance of fiat money was in 13th century China, but it is but it's used on a major scale. It did not occur until colonial America. The experience was disastrous, leading to massive inflation, unemployment, loss of property, political unrest during one period when the Bank of England forced the colonies to abandon their fiat money. General prosperity quickly returned. The Revolutionary War brought fiat money back to the colonies with a vengeance. The economic chaos that resulted led in the colonial governments to impose price controls and harsh legal tender laws, neither of which were effective. Fractal money is defined as paper money with precious metal backing for part, not all, in its stated value. It was introduced in Europe when goldsmiths began to issue receipts for gold, which they did not have. Thus, only a fraction of their receipts were redeemable. Fractional money always degenerates into pure fiat money. So we can think about that as we're sort of talking about this idea of the Fed coin, the Digi Fed coin. So when Bitcoin and cryptocurrency started coming around, the idea was that, this blockchain, it was like impenetrable. There was no really way to figure out who owned it, where it came from, yada, yada, yada. It was about privacy. And that was the point of having this cryptocurrency. So as we're going to find out, it's going to be totally inverted when the Fed rolls out their currency, and their crypto coin or their digital coin or whatever the fuck they're going to wind up calling it, and it's not going to be backed by anything. It's not even going to be fractalized banking. As you could see that now, is just like they just keep printing money. Biden the other day was talking about sending another like $30 billion to Ukraine or something. Where is this coming from? They're just printing it. Well, your tax dollars. I don't know why we're paying tax. If we could just print money, why are we still paying taxes? All right, I'm going to jump here through the book. The business of banking began in Europe in the 14th century. Its function was to evaluate, exchange, and safeguard people's coins. In the beginning, there were notable examples of totally honest banks which operated with remarkable efficiency considering the vast variety of coinage they handled. They also issued paper receipts, which were so dependable they freely circulated as money and cheated no one in the process, but there was a great demand for more money and more loans, and the temptation soon caused the bankers to seek easier paths. They began lending out pieces of paper they said were receipts, but were in fact counterfeit. The public could not tell one from the other and accepted both of them as money. From that point forward, the receipts in circulation exceeded the gold held in reserve, and the age of fractional reserve banking had dawned. This led immediately to what would become an almost unbroken record from then to the present, a record of inflation, booms and busts, suspension of payments, bank failures, repudiations of currencies, and reoccurring spasms of economic chaos. The Bank of England was formed in 1694 to institutionalize fractal reserve banking. The world's first central bank, it's introduced the concepts of a partnership between bankers and politicians. The politicians would receive spendable money created out of nothing by the banks, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, without having to raise taxes. In return, the bankers would receive a commission on the transaction, deceptively called interest, which would continue to perpetuity, since it all seemed to be wrapped up in the mysterious rituals of banking, which the common man was not expected to understand. There is practically no opposition to this scheme. The arrangement proved so profitable to the participants that it soon spread to many other countries in Europe and eventually to the United States. The Mandrake Mechanism. In the 1940s, there was a comic book character called Mandrake the Magician. So Mandrake was a newspaper syndicated comic strip. Eventually, I'm sure he had his own comic books. The same guy that did The Phantom, The Ghost Who Walks. The guy in the Billy Zane in the purple bodysuit. And I believe he was eventually owned by King's Syndication, who also had The Phantom, The Ghost Who Walks, and like Flash Gordon. In the 80s, they had like an Avengers style cartoon where they would all be like working the same case. Flash Gordon, The Ghost Who Walks, The Phantom, and Mandrake the Magician. So Mandrake was you're a big comic nerd. Here we go. It was a funny trope, I guess. Back in the olden days, to have magicians pose as prestidigitators. So this guy was like a stage magician, but he actually had real bullshit that he could use. And I think this book might be wrong, because I don't remember him making something out of nothing. I remember him like doing a lot of like, I think like he had a cloak of he had a cloak of legislation. He had a cloak of levitation, and his hat and his walking stick did weird stuff, and his big deal is that he could hypnotize, like he would hypnotize people. Anyhow, let's get back to this. Enough about all this. His speciality was creating things out of nothing, and when appropriate, to make them disappear back to that same void. It is fitting, therefore, that the process to be described in this section would be named in his honor. In the previous chapters, we examined the technique developed by the political and monetary scientists to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending. This was not an entirely accurate description because it implies that money is created first and then waits for someone to borrow it. On the other hand, textbooks on banking often state that money is created out of debt. This is also misleading because it implies that debt exists first and then is converted into money. In truth, money is not created until the instant it is borrowed. It is the act of borrowing which causes it to spring into existence. And incidentally, it is the act of paying off that debt that causes it to vanish. There is no short phrase that perfectly describes the process, so until one is invented along the way, we shall continue using the phrase, quote, creating money out of nothing, unquote, and occasionally add, quote, for the purpose of lending, unquote, where necessary to further clarify the meaning. So, let us now leave the historical figures of the past and jump to their future, in other words, into the present, and see how far this money debt creation process has been carried and how it works. And the first fact that needs to be considered is that our money today has no gold or silver behind it whatsoever. The fraction is not 54% nor 15%. It is 0%. It has traveled the path of all previous fractional monies in history and already has degenerated into pure fiat money. The fact that most of it is in the form of a checkbook balances rather than paper currency is a mere technicality. And the fact that bankers speak about reserve ratios is eyewash. The so-called reserve to which they refer are, in fact, treasury bonds and other certificates of debt. Our money is pure fiat through and through. The second fact that needs to be clearly understood is that, in spite of technical jargon and seemingly complicated procedures, the actual mechanism by which the Federal Reserve creates money is quite simple. They do it exactly the same way the goldsmiths of old did, except, of course, the goldsmiths were limited by the need to hold some precious metal in reserve, whereas the Fed has no such restriction. The Federal Reserve is canted. The Federal Reserve itself is amazingly frank about this process. In a booklet published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York tells us currency cannot be redeemed or exchanged for treasury gold or any other assets used as backing. The question of just what assets back a Federal Reserve note has but bookkeeping significance. Elsewhere in the same publication, we are told banks are creating money based on a borrower's promise to pay, the IOU. Banks create money by monetizing the private debt of businesses and individuals. In a booklet entitled Modern Money Mechanics, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago says, in the United States, neither paper currency nor deposits have value as commodities. Intrinsically, a dollar bill is just a piece of paper. Deposits are merely book entries. Coins do have some intrinsic value as metal, but generally far less than their face amount. What then makes these instruments, checks, paper money, and coins acceptable at face value in payment of all debts for all other monetary uses? Mainly, it is the confidence people have that they will be able to exchange such money for other financial assets in real goods and services whenever they choose to do so. This partly is a matter of law. Currency has been designated legal tender by the government. That is, it must be accepted. In the fine print of a footnote in a bulletin in the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, we find surprisingly candid explanation. Modern monetary systems have a fiat base, literally money by decree, with depository institutions acting as fiduciaries, creating obligations against themselves with a fiat base acting in part as reserves. The decree appears on the currency notes. Quote, "This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private," unquote. While no individual could refuse to accept such money for debt repayment, exchange contracts could easily be composed to thwart its use in everyday commerce. However, a forceful explanation as to why money is accepted is that the federal government requires it as payment for tax liabilities. Anticipation of the need to clear the debt creates a demand for the pure fiat dollar. Money would vanish without debt. It is difficult for Americans to come to grips with the fact that their total money supply is backed by nothing but debt. And it is even more mind-boggling to visualize that if everyone paid back all what was borrowed, there would be no money left in existence. That's right, there would not be one penny in circulation. All coins, all paper currency would be returned to the bank vaults, and there would not be $1 in anyone's checking account. In short, all money would disappear. Mariner Eccles was the governor of the Federal Reserve System in 1941. On September 30th of that year, Eccles was asked to give testimony before the House Committee on Banking and Currency. The purpose of the hearing was to obtain information regarding the role of the Federal Reserve in creating conditions that led to the Depression of the 1930s. Congressman Wright Patman, who was chairman of that committee, asked how the Fed got money to purchase $2 billion worth of government bonds in 1933. And this is the exchange that follows. Eccles, we created it. Patman, out of what? Eccles, out of the right to issue credit money. Patman, and there's nothing behind it. There is, except our government's credit. Eccles, that is what our money system is. If there were no debt in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. It must be realized that while money may represent an asset to selected individuals, when it is considered as an aggregate of the total money supply, it is not an asset at all. A man who borrows $1,000 may think that he has increased his financial position by that amount, but he has not. His $1,000 cash asset is offset by his $1,000 loan liability, and his position is zero. The bank accounts are exactly the same on a larger scale. Add up all the bank accounts in the nation, and it would be easy to assume that all the money represents a giant pool of assets which support the economy. Yet, every bit of his money is owned by someone. Some will owe nothing, others will owe many times what they possess. All added together, the national balance is zero. We think this money is but a grand illusion. The reality is debt. I remember looking at a guy panhandling on the road one time. And generally, I try to be as gracious as I can be with those people nowadays. It was not always like that for me. But I remember he was holding a sign up that says, "I have $0." I have $0. I have no bank account. And I remember looking at him and being like, well, that lucky fuck. I'm down still 60 grand in school loans. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Robert Hemphill was a credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. The foreword to a book by Irving Fisher entitled 100% Money, Hemphill stated this: if all the bank loans were paid and no one could have bank deposits, there would be not a dollar of coin in currency or in circulation. This was a staggering thought. We are completely dependent on the commercial bank. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. when one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless situation is almost incredible, but there it is. With the knowledge that money in America is based on debt, it should not come to a surprise to learn that the Federal Reserve System is not the least interested in seeing the reduction in debt in this country, regardless of public utterances to the contrary. Here is the bottom line from the system's own publication. The Federal Reserve Banking of Philadelphia says, a large and growing number of analysts, on the other hand, now regard the national debt as something useful, if not an actual blessing. They believe the national debt need not be reduced at all. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago adds, debt, public and private, is here to stay. It plays an essential role in the economic process. What is required is not the abolition of debt, but its prudent use and intelligent management. So what's wrong with a little debt? Here's a kind of fascinating appeal to this theory. It gives those who expound it an aura of intellectualism. It appears to be able to grasp complex economic principles that is beyond the comprehension of mere mortals, and for the less academically minded, it offers the comfort of at least sounding moderate. After all, what's wrong with a little debt? Prudently used, intelligently managed, the answer is nothing, provided the debt is based on an honest transaction. There's plenty of wrong with it if it is based upon fraud. An honest transaction is one which the borrower pays an agreed sum to return for the temporary use of a lender's assets. That asset could be anything of tangible value. If it were an automobile, for example, the borrower would pay rent. If it is money, the rent is called interest. Either way, the concept is the same. When we go to the lender, either a bank or private party, and we receive a loan of money, we are willing to pay interest on the loan in recognition of the fact that the money we are borrowing is an asset which we want to use. It seems only fair to pay a rental fee for that asset to the person who owns it. It is not easy to acquire an automobile. It is not easy to acquire money, real money, that is. The money we are borrowing was earned on someone's labor and talent. They were fully entitled to receive interest on it. But what are we to think of money that is created by a mere stroke of a pen or a click of the computer key? Why should anyone collect rental fees on that? When banks place credit on your checking account, they are merely pretending to lend you money. In reality, they have nothing to lend. Even the money that is indebted depositors have placed with them was originally created out of nothing in response to someone else's loan. So what entitles the bank to collect rent on nothing? It's immaterial that men everywhere are forced by law to accept these nothing certificates in exchange for real goods and services. We are talking here not about what is legal, but what is moral. As Thomas Jefferson observed in the time of his protracted battle against the central banking in the United States, quote, no one has a natural right to trade of money lender, but he who has the money to lend, unquote. Centuries ago, usury was defined as any interest charged for a loan. Modern usage has redefined it as excessive interest. Certainly, any amount of interest charged for a pretend loan is excessive. The dictionary, therefore, needs a new definition. Usury, the charging of any interest on a loan of fiat money. Let us, therefore, look at a debt and interest in this light. Thomas Edison summed up the immorality of the system when he said, people who will not turn a shovel full of dirt on the project nor contribute a pound of materials will collect more money than will the people who will supply all the materials and do all the work. Is that an exaggeration? Let us consider the purchase of a $100,000 home in which $30,000 represents the cost of the land, the architect's fees, sales commissions, building permits, and that sort of thing. In $70,000 is the cost of labor and the building materials, and that home buyer puts up $30,000 as a down payment when $70,000 must be borrowed. If the loan is issued at 11% over a 30-year period, the amount of interest paid will be $167,806, which means the amount paid to those who loan money is about 2.5 times greater than paid to those who provided all the labor, all the materials. And it's true, this figure represents the time value that money over 30 years and easily could be justified on the basis that a lender deserves to be compensated for surrendering the use of his capital over half a lifetime. But that assumes the lender actually had something to surrender. If he had earned the capital, saved it, and when he loaned it for construction to someone else's house, what are we to think? However, about a lender who did nothing to earn the money, he had not saved it, in fact simply created out of thin air, what is the time value of nothing? Sorry, I gotta do some real-time highlighting and note-taking here. As we have already shown, every dollar that exists today, either in the form of currency, checkbook money, or even credit card money, in other words, our entire money supply exists only because it was borrowed by someone, perhaps not you, but someone. That means every American dollar in the entire world is earning daily and compound interest for the banks which created them. A portion of every business venture, every investment, every profit, every transaction which involves money, and that even includes losses and the payments of taxes, a portion of all of this earmarked as a payment to a bank. And what did the banks do to earn this perpetually flowing river of wealth? Did they lend out their own capital obtained through the investments of stockholders? Did they lend out hard-earned savings of their depositors? No, neither of these were their major sources of income. They simply waved some magic wand called fiat money. The flow of such unearned wealth under the guise of interest can only be viewed as usury of the highest magnitude. Even if there were no reasons to abolish the Fed, the fact that it is the supreme instrument of usury would be more than sufficient by itself. Who creates the money to pay the interest? One of the most perplexing questions associated with this process is, where does the money come from to pay the interest? If you borrow $10,000 from a bank at 9%, you owe $10,900. But if the bank only manufactures $10,000 for the loan, it would seem, therefore, that there is no way that you and all the others with similar loans could possibly pay off your indebtedness. The amount of money you put into circulation just isn't enough to cover the total debt, including your interest. This had led some to the conclusion that it is necessary for you to borrow the $900 for the interest, and that in turn leads to still more interest. The assumption is that the more we borrow, the more we have to borrow, and that debt based on fiat money is a never-ending spiral leading inexorably to more and more debt. This is a partial truth. It is true that there is not enough money created to include the interest, but it is a fallacy that the only way to pay it back is to borrow still more. The assumption fails to take into account the exchange value of labor. Let us assume that you pay back your $10,000 loan at a rate of approximately $900 a month, and at about $80 of that represents your interest. You realize you are hard-pressed to make your payment, so you decide to take a part-time job. The bank, on the other hand, is now making $80 profit each month on your loan. Since this amount is classified as interest, it is not extinguished as the larger portion, which is the return of the loan itself. So this remains as spendable money on the account of the bank. The decision then is to have the bank floors waxed once a week. You respond to an ad in the paper and that you are hired at $80 per month to do the job. The result is that you earn the money to pay the interest on your loan, and this is the point, the money you received is the same money which you had previously paid, as long as you perform the labor for the bank each month. The same dollars go into the bank as interest and out the revolving doors as your wages, and then back to the bank as loan repayment. It is not necessary that you work directly for the bank. No matter where you earn the money, its origin was a bank and is ultimately destination. Ultimately, its destination is a bank. The loop through which it travels can be large or small, and the fact remains the interest is paid eventually by human effort. At the significant fact, even more startling than the assumption that is not enough money is created to pay back the interest. It is that the total of the human effort is ultimately for the benefit of those who create fiat money. It is a form of modern serfdom in which the great mass of society works as indentured servants to a ruling class of financial nobility. Understanding the illusion. That's really all one needs to know about the operation of the banking cartel under the protection of the Federal Reserve. But it would be a shame to stop here without taking a look at the actual cogs, mirrors, and pulleys that make the magical mechanism work. It is truly a fascinating engine of mystery and deception. Ooh, that's good. Bear with me here. I'll be right back. We'll be right back to continue the show on the fly, highlighting and note-taking. Let us, therefore, turn our attention to the actual process by which the magicians create the illusions of modern money. First, we shall stand back for a general view to see the overall action. Then we shall move closer and examine each component in detail. The Mandrake Mechanism, an overview. Debt. The entire function of this machine is to convert debt into money. It's just that simple. First, the Fed takes all the government bonds which the public does not buy and writes checks to Congress in exchange for them. It acquires other debt obligations as well. The government bonds comprise most of its inventory. There is no money to back up this check. These fiat dollars are created on the spot for that purpose by calling those bonds reserves. The Fed then uses them to base for creating 9 additional dollars for every dollar created for the bonds themselves. The money created for the bonds is spent by the government, whereas the money created for on the tops of those bonds is a source for all the bank loans made to the nation's businesses and individuals. The results of this process is the same as creating money on a printing press. The illusion is based on an accounting trick rather than a printing trick. The bottom line is that Congress and the banking cartel have entered into a partnership in which the cartel has the privilege of collecting interest on money which it creates out of nothing. A perpetual override on every American dollar that exists in the world. Congress, on the other hand, has access to unlimited funding without having to tell the voters their taxes are being raised through the process of inflation. If you understand this paragraph, you understand the Federal Reserve System. Money. So debt's at the top, then that paragraph that I just read, and the bottom equals money. That's the overview. Now for a more detailed view. There are 3 general ways in which the Federal Reserve creates fiat money out of debt. One is by making loans to the member banks through what is called the discount window. The second is by purchasing treasury bonds as other certificates of debt through what is called the open market committee. The third is by changing the so-called reserve ratio that member banks are required to hold. Each method is merely a different path to the same objective, taking in IOUs and converting them into spendable money. The discount window. The discount window is merely bankers' language for a loan window. The banks run short of money. The Federal Reserve stands ready as the banker's bank to lend it. There are many reasons for them to need loans since they hold reserves of only about 1 or 2% of their deposits in vault cash and 8 to 9% in securities. Their operating margin is extremely thin. It is common for them to experience temporary negative balances caused by usual customer demand for cash and unusually large clusters of checks all clearing through other banks at the same time. Sometimes they make bad loans, and these former assets are removed from their books. Their reserves are also decreased and may now, in fact, become negative. Finally, there is the profit motive. When banks borrow from the Federal Reserve at one interest rate and lend it out at a higher interest rate, there is an obvious advantage. But that is merely the beginning. When a bank borrows $1 from the Fed, it becomes $1 reserve. Since the banks are required to keep reserves of only about 10%, they actually can loan $9 for each dollar is borrowed. So let's take a look at the math. Oh boy, I might just skip this part. The open market operation. Okay, here, hold on. So let's take a look at the math. I'm skipping ahead. In other words, the bank borrows $1 million and can almost double it in a year. That's leveraged. But don't forget the source of that leverage. The manufacture of another $9 million, which is added to the nation's money supply. The open market operation. The most important method used by the Federal Reserve for the creation of fiat money is the purchase and sale of securities on the open market. But before jumping into this, a word of warning. Don't expect what follows to make any sense. Just be prepared to know that this is how they do it. The trick lies in the use of the words and phrases, which have technical meaning quite different from what they imply to the average citizen. So keep an eye on the words. They are not meant to explain, but to deceive. In spite of first appearance, the process is not complicated. It is just absurd. The Mandrake Mechanism, a detailed view. Start with government debt. The federal government adds ink to a piece of paper and creates an impressive designs around the edges and calls it a treasury bond note. It is merely a promise to pay the specified sum at a specified interest on a specified date. As we shall see the following steps, this debt eventually becomes the foundation for almost the entire nation's money supply. In reality, the government has created cash, but it does not yet look like cash. To convert these IOUs into paper bills, the checkbook money is the function of the Federal Reserve System. To bring about the transformation, the bond is given to the Fed, where it is then classified as a security asset. Oh, apparently it can be classified as a list of things. We'll take it one at a time. Security assets, Federal Reserve checks, government deposits, government checks, commercial bank deposits, bank reserves, excess reserves, and bank loans. More commercial bank deposits, bank fiat money, total fiat money, hidden tax, and booms, busts, and depressions. So, security assets. An instrument of government debt is considered an asset because it is assumed that the government will keep its promise to pay. This is based on its ability to obtain whatever money is needed through taxation. Thus, the strength of its assets is the power to take back which it gives. So the Federal Reserve now has an asset which can be used to offset liability. It then creates this liability by adding ink to yet another piece of paper and exchanging it with that government in return for the asset. The second piece of paper is a Federal Reserve check. There is no money in any account to cover this check. Anyone else doing this would be sent to prison. It is legal for the Fed, however, because Congress wants that money. And this is the easiest way to get it. To raise taxes would be political suicide. Ha, ha, ha. To depend on the public to buy all these bonds would not be realistic, especially if interest rates were set artificially low. And to print very large quantities of currency would be obvious and controversial. This is hilarious. What did we say? This book was published in the 90s. Let me see. I think we looked at this last time. copyright 94. So that's funny how things have changed. To print very large quantities of currency would be obvious and controversial. Okay, that's where I was. This way, the process is mysteriously wrapped up in the banking system. The end result, however, is the same as turning on government printing presses and simply manufacturing fiat money to pay government expenses. Yet in accounting terms, the books are said to be balanced because the liability of the money is offset by the asset of the IOU. The Federal Reserve check received by the government then is endorsed and sent back to the Federal Reserve Bank, where it now becomes a government deposit. Once the Federal Reserve check has been deposited into the government's account, it is used to pay government expenses. Thus, it is transformed into many government checks. These checks become the means by which the first wave of fiat money floods into the economy. Recipients now deposit them into their own bank accounts, where they become commercial bank deposits. Commercial bank deposits immediately take on split personality. On one hand, they are liabilities, but the bank, because they are owned back to the depositors, but as long as they remain in the bank, they also are considered as assets because they are on hand. Once again, the books are balanced, the asset, offset, and liabilities. The process does not stop there. Through the magic of fractional reserve banking, the deposits are made to serve an additional and more lucrative purpose. To accomplish this, the on-hand deposits now become reclassified in the books, and they are called bank reserves. Reserves for what? These are paying off depositors should they want to close their accounts? No. That's a lowly function they served when they were classified as mere assets. Now that they've been given the name of reserves, they become the magic wand to materialize even larger amounts of fiat money. In fact, this is where the real action is, at the level of the commercial banks. Here's how it works. The banks are permitted by the Fed to hold only 10% of their deposits in reserve. That means if they receive a deposit of $1 million from the first wave of fiat money created by the Fed, they have 900,000 more that they are required to keep on hand. The banker's language, that is called excess reserves. The word excess is a tip-off that these so-called reserves have a special destiny. Now that they have been transmuted into an excess, they are considered as available for lending. And so, in due course, these excessive reserves are converted into bank loans. But wait a minute. How can this money be loaned out when it is owned by the original depositors, who are still free to write checks and spend it at any time they wish? Isn't that a double claim against the same money? And the answer is that when the new loans are made, they are not made with the same money at all. They are made with the brand new money created out of thin air for that purpose. The nation's money supply simply increases by 90% of the bank's deposits. Furthermore, this new money is far more interesting to the banks than the old. The old money which they have received from depositors requires them to pay out of interest or perform services for the privilege of using it. But with this new money, the bank collects interest instead, which is not too bad considering its cost to them to make. Nor is that the end of the process. When the second wave of fiat money moves into the economy, it comes right back into the banking system, just as the first wave did, in the form of more commercial bank deposits. The process now repeats with the slightly smaller numbers each time around. What was a loan on Friday then comes back to the banks as a deposit on Monday. Deposit is then reclassified as a reserve, and 90% of that becomes an excess. Reserves, which once again become available for new loans. Thus, the $1 million of the first wave fiat money gives birth to 900,000. The second wave that gives birth to 810,000. The third wave is 900,000 less on 10% reserve. It takes about 28 times through the revolving door of deposits becoming loans, becoming deposits, becoming more loans, until the process pays itself out to the maximum effect, which is bank fiat money equals 9 times the government debt. The amount of fiat money created by the banking cartel is approximately 9 times the amount of the original government debt, which made the entire process possible. When the original debt itself is added to that figure, we finally have fiat money equals 10 times government debt. The total amount of fiat money is created by the Federal Reserve and the commercial banks together is approximately 10 times the amount of the underlying government debt. Oh my God, this is giving me a headache. To the degree that this newly created money floods into the economy in the excess of goods and services, it causes the purchasing powers of all money, both old and new, to decline. Prices go up because relative value of the money has gone down. The result is the same as that if it is purchasing power has been taken from us in taxes. In reality, this process, therefore, it is a hidden tax. Remember, we've been talking about this hidden tax, this as inflation. Without realizing it, the Americans have paid over the years, in addition to their federal income tax and excise taxes, to a completely tax equal to approximately 10 times the national debt. That is still not the end of it, since our money supply is purely an arbitrary entity with nothing behind it except debt. Its size can go up and down as well as up. When people are going deeper into debt, the nation's money supply expands and the prices go up. But when they pay off their debts, they refuse to renew. The money supply contracts and prices tumble. That is exactly what happens in time of economic or political uncertainty. The alteration between periods of expansion and contraction of the money supply is the underlying cause of booms, busts, and depression. Who benefits from all of this? Certainly not the average citizen. Only the beneficiaries of the political sciences and Congress, who enjoy the effect of unlimited revenue to perpetuate their power. This monetary scientist within the banking cartel called the Federal Reserve System, who have been able to harness the American people without their knowing, and the yoke of modern feudalism. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. National debt not necessary for inflation. Because the Federal Reserve can be counted on to monetize virtually any amount of government debt and cause this process of expanding the money supply is the primary cause of inflation, it is tempting to jump to the conclusion that the federal debt and inflation are but two aspects of the same phenomenon. This, however, is not necessarily true. It is quite possible to have either one without the other. The banking cartel holds a monopoly on the manufacture of money. Consequently, money is created only when the IOUs are monetized by the Fed or by commercial banks. When private individuals, corporations, or institutions purchase government bonds, they must use money that they have previously earned and saved. In other words, no new money is created because they are using funds that are already in existence. Therefore, the sale of government bonds of the banking system is inflationary. But when sold to the private sector, it is not. That is the primary reason the United States avoided mass inflation during the 80s, when the federal government was going into debt at a greater rate than ever before in history. By keeping interest rates high, the bonds became attractive to private investors, including those in other countries. Very little new money was created because most of the bonds were purchased with American dollars already in existence. This, of course, was a temporary fix at best. Today, these bonds are continually maturing and are being replaced by still more bonds to include the original debt plus accumulated interest. Eventually, this process must come to an end, and when it does, the Fed will have no choice but to literally buy back all of the debt of the 80s, that is, to replace all of the formerly invested private money with new newly manufactured fiat money plus a great deal more to cover the interest, then we will understand the meaning of inflation. On the other side of the coin, the Federal Reserve has an option of manufacturing money even if the federal government does not go deeper into debt. For example, a huge expansion of the money supply leading up to the stock market crash in 1929 occurred at a time when the national debt was being paid off. Every year from 1920 to 1930, the federal revenue exceeded expenses and there were relatively few government bonds being offered. The massive inflation of the money supply was made possible by converting commercial bank loans into reserves, the Fed account window, and by the Fed's purchase of bankers' acceptances, which were commercial contracts for the purchase of goods. Now, the options are even greater. The Monetary Control Act of 1980 has made it more possible for the creature from Jekyll Island to monetize virtually any debt instrument, including IOUs from foreign governments. The apparent purpose of this legislation was to make it possible to bail out those governments which are having trouble paying the interest on the loans from American banks. Oh, I'm skipping ahead. Taxes are not even necessary. It is a sobering thought that the federal government now could operate even at its current level of spending without levying any taxes whatsoever. All it has to do is create the required money through the Federal Reserve System by monetizing its own bonds. In fact, most of the money it now spends is obtained that way. The idea of eliminating the IRS sounds like good news. Remember that the inflation that results from monetizing the debt is just as much of a tax as any other. But because it is hidden and so few Americans understand how it works, it's more politically popular than a tax that is out in the open. Inflation can be likened to a game of Monopoly in which the game's bankers has no limits in the amount of money he can distribute. With each throw of the dice, he reaches under the table and brings up another stack of those paper tokens, which all the players must use. If the bank, I remember doing this as a kid, playing Monopoly and running out of money and having to cut and make paper money, homemade paper money to replace the dollars that we run out of the bank. I'm not a giant Monopoly player. I don't generally understand economics very well at all. And if you look at my bank account, that would make sense. In our real world, that is exactly the case. Obviously, he is going to end up owning the property. But in the meantime, the increasing flood of money swirls out from the banker that engulfs the players as the quantity of money becomes greater. The relative worth of each token becomes less and the price bids for the properties goes up. The game is called Monopoly for a reason. In the end, one person holds all the property and everyone else is bankrupt. But what does it matter? It's only a game. Unfortunately, it's not a game in the real world. In our livelihoods, our food, our shelter, it does not make a difference if there is only one winner. It makes a big difference if that winner obtained his monopoly simply by manufacturing everyone else's money. And, the theme of these shows have kind of been the backbone of me talking about all the prepping and stuff I'm doing. So that seems like the perfect place to end the show. I'm John Towers. This is the Abracast. Hit up Abracast.com. Check out the feature topic link. And Storefront. Check out the Storefront. Check out some books. Some of those comic books. I'll let Hilla tell you all about it.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past, put your present in context, and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot Card Deck. Your body is your temple, so let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts and other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes, more bonus audio, additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.